When I talk about things that connect the Xenoblade series to the previous Xeno games, you might notice my tendency to bring up something called perfect works, and talk about how things are specific episodes of that. This time, I'm going to try and finally shed some light on it, for people who don't really know what I'm talking about. Also, first off, I'm sorry if I come off as having a bit less energy than I usually do. I've been recording a lot in the past week, not just Let's Play stuff, but also, that Direct happened. There's a lot of Xenoblade 1 definitive stuff that I had to talk about, so I don't want to kill my throat, so I'm going to be a bit more laid back on this one. And also, yes, I'm still not done with all the DE analysis and things, so unfortunately there might be a bit more of a delay on Xenogears Recap 3 than I wish, but once I get regularly into the swing of doing those, I promise they'll be coming out a lot more frequently. This video will also involve spoilers for every main Xeno game, although I personally have not finished all of Xenogears or played any of the Xenosaga games myself, so pretty much all the knowledge I have on these is secondhand. When I say I'm playing them for the first time, I don't really mean I'm going in blind. I know the general outlines and the big important overarching things that happen in the plots, but not the moment-to-moment things, and those are just as important to me, so I still consider my first playthrough an important sacred thing. So basically that's just a long-winded way of me saying that the Xenogears and Xenosaga info I give here might not be 100% accurate down to the finest detail, but the overall general idea, which is the important part in this case, will still be correct. So, what is Perfect Works? It is the name of the Xenogears art book. If you know the Blade games, you'll know that X, 2, and 1 all got very good art books revealing concept stuff, information, and even supplemental stuff on the story. Xenogears is no different, but it's what was shown off on a very specific page of that book that's important. This 2-page spread, revealing a 15,000-year timeline and showing that Xenogears, as we know it, was actually part 5 of a 6-part story. Although a little teaser after the end of the game revealed that part as well, this actually explains what that story was originally going to be. When I refer to Perfect Works, I refer to this story outlined here and not the art book as a whole, even though certain ideas in the art book that weren't implemented in Xenogears, beyond just this timeline and big story, were technically used in later games. Perfect Works talks about the full story of Xenogears, involving 3 arcs and being separated into 6 episodes. Episode 1 comprises the first arc, which is about humanity and its adventures in space a few thousand years after Earth was lost. Episodes 2 and 4 all comprise the second arc, which is the history of the planet Xenogears takes place on. Episode 6 is very, very ambiguous, and pretty much nothing about it is revealed here, but it is the next arc, what comes next. The later Xeno games are not necessarily retelling the same story as Xenogears. Only Gears uses the actual story exactly as it's written in Perfect Works. The later games are more spiritual successors to Gears that either use elements of the other episodes or take themes from previous games themselves. That means that Perfect Works is specifically the roadmap of the complete Xenogears story, not anything else, but the later games borrow ideas from it and can be compared to it still because of all the similarities they share. It's also because of all these spiritual connections that we can use Perfect Works and the lore of previous games to make educated guesses about things we're not certain of in the Blade series. Any theory or interpretation of something based on info from Perfect Works or Xenogears and Xenosaga isn't necessarily correct, but unless it's contradicted directly by something or disproven with a later game, I prefer to think that it's the best possible explanation because there is technically precedent for something like that happening. One idea that's occasionally thrown around as a way to connect everything together is the concept of a shared multiverse that all the different game universes inhabit. Under this interpretation, there are 4 timelines, as detailed in this table, which I'll be referring to a lot in the future of the video. The Gears timeline, which contains Xenogears, the Saga timeline, which contains the entire Xenosaga series, or the canon parts, not counting things like the anime, the Blade timeline, which contains Xenoblades 1 and 2, and the Cross timeline, which contains Xenoblade X. I'll be explaining the overall Perfect Works story in depth through the lens of specifically Xenoblade 2, for 2 reasons. First off, it's very familiar to most of my fans, and second off, it has the unique distinction of being the only timeline that has actual released games describing the events of multiple episodes, which is kind of a big deal. So, let's start at the very beginning, or the first important thing. For all we know, the universe exists as it does in reality up until the Conduit, which I will refer to as the Zohar for the rest of this video because that's its more common name, is discovered in Africa in the 21st century. This leads to a rapid advancement and growth in humanity's level of technology, until eventually something happens and Earth is lost. In this continuity, we do know exactly what happened that caused the Earth to become lost, which was of course Klaus's incident with the Zohar. Earth is also not necessarily lost per se, at least not in the same way as it is in most other continuities, but the fact that pretty much the entire biosphere is wiped out and life has to start anew, with no knowledge of the past, I'd say counts pretty well. This is also what leads into Episode 1, a war taking place in space. In this continuity, that would of course be the war against the Saviorite rebels that we see, presumably some sort of world government fighting against them, that leads up to the Klaus incident. It's also important to note that the artifices, including Ion, which is allegedly capable of wiping the biosphere of a planet, were used as weapons in this war. This is also playing a bit fast and loose with the continuity established in the original Perfect Work story, because in that story, Earth was lost, and then humanity colonized the stars for a couple thousand years, and then the war that was Episode 1 started, whereas here the war is a bit smaller scale, just taking place in and around Earth's aerospace as far as we know, and instead leading up to Earth being destroyed. After Episode 1, or at the Klaus incident, there is technically a split in the timeline, going from the Xenoblade 2 universe, which focuses around the remnants of Earth, and the Xenoblade 1 universe, which takes place in a different dimension, but for now we're just going to focus on 2. And then Episode 2, New Life on a New World. This would describe events that we're not really told about at all, but in this case would likely talk about the development of life on the Titans, and how civilization came to be with early formative wars, and probably the establishment of several nations that become key players later on throughout the story. Episode 3 focuses on a certain advanced civilization. We don't know too much about the history of Allrest, but if I could pick one, it would likely be Judicium, because they have knowledge on the level of things equal to and beyond what the Indoline Praetorium can do in Xenoblade 2, which is several thousand years of technology developing. Then we have Episode 4, which could be considered a lot of things, but I think the best way to put it here is the tragic villain's origin. In this case, Episode 4 is Torna the Golden Country, which focuses on the origins of Jin and describes sort of how he ended up becoming an antagonist to the heroes in the main game of Xenoblade 2. It also sort of focuses on Mikhail, but I think Jin is kind of the more important one here. And then, 500 years later, we get Episode 5, Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Episode 5 is the one where the Zohar departs, which it does after Klaus dies, and the big thing that happens here, prior to the Zohar departing, is the main cast defeating a representation of the Demiurge, in this case being the Artifice Ion, which was first created or first shown off in Episode 1, if we got to see those events more detailed. We're not going to talk about Episode 6 yet, though, because I want to go into the Xenoblade 1 side. Obviously, the early events are exactly the same, leading right up into the universe split. The equivalent of Episode 2 would instead be Zanza and Meyneth creating the Titans and creating the life there, and probably how civilization came to be in that situation. Episode 3, the Advanced Civilization, would be potentially the Giants on Bionis, or the heyday of the Machina on Mechonis. There are a bunch of potential different things, but those seem like they would make the most sense here. Episode 4 would likely be the previous war between Bionis and Mechonis, prior to the one that happens in the main game. That being the one that describes Egil's origins and going from being a friend to the life of Bionis to their bitter enemy. This would also describe Argles, how he became Zanza, and all that stuff, and very much, if it was made into a full game, would be a prequel setting up Egil's villain origin in the main game of Xenoblade 1. It's worth noting that traditionally, I guess you could say, Episode 4 takes place 500 years before Episode 5, but based on what we know about the timeline in Xenoblade 1, this war probably was several millennia before the game instead of several hundred years. Episode 5, the Zohar departing. Well, on the 2 side, the Zohar only departs because Shulk kills the other half of Klaus, Zanza, on the 1 side. Zanza is also a representation of the Demiurge, and he was also sort of created at the end of Episode 1 when half of Klaus was flung into the 1 universe. Now it's Episode 6 time. Episode 6 is the only thing that we have no knowledge about whatsoever, other than in the original Perfect Works story, it took place directly after Episode 5, and was basically the unknown mysterious future. But you could also sort of think of it as the end of the universe. There is no knowledge about what happens after the events of either Xenoblade 1 or 2, but a couple potential things are a re-merging of the 2 universes, or merely the characters from 1 crossing back over into the rejuvenated Earth on the 2 side, or potentially, if the theories that there's going to be a Melia-focused epilogue or any sort of post-original story content in Xenoblade Definitive Edition, this could possibly be the first true telling of an Episode 6. Next, I'd like to quickly go over the Gears timeline and explain what the different episodes of the original Perfect Works would have been if they'd ever actually come out, as in the 5 Xenogears games that were never made. As with the Blade timeline, the Zohar was discovered on Earth and eventually gave humanity the ability to develop technology and head out for the stars. What caused Earth to become lost this time is unknown, but what is known is that 15,000 years prior to Xenogears, humanity set out and started colonizing the galaxy. They eventually set up a home base on a new planet that became the center of a galactic federation of sorts, and became known as New or Neo Jerusalem, while the Lost Earth became simply known as Lost Jerusalem. 10,000 years about before the beginning of Xenogears, an interplanetary war that had broken out, intensified, and a huge devastation across the entire galaxy occurred. A system known as the Deus system, a powerful bioweapon, was developed at this point in time, and would become very important because, I guess sort of somewhere in between episodes 1 and 2, it's put on a transport ship, but ends up taking control of it, crashing it down on a previously uncharted planet. This ship is the Eldridge, and the opening movie of Xenogears shows Deus taking control and it crashing on the planet. Episode 2 is the story of the early conflicts in the life on this new Xenogears planet. It revolves around the story of Abel, the sole survivor of the Eldridge crash, and Ellie, a woman made for him by a computer connected to the Zohar, and their struggles against the humans created by Deus in its large, convoluted, millennium-long plan to gain power and ascend off into the stars. The name Ellie is probably ringing a bit of a bell for some people, but Abel is also very important too, because these two characters then start reincarnating, being star-crossed lovers across time, and it's them in different incarnations that are the focus of the remaining known episodes of Xenogears. Ellie keeps her name throughout all her incarnations, but Abel's changes every time, so it's easy to quickly describe the future episodes just by mentioning them and identifying them with the name of Abel's incarnation in that time period. Episode 3 takes place 6,000 years later, 4,000 before Xenogears, and focuses on Abel's incarnation, Kim Kasim, in the civilization of Zeboim, which has a similar technology level to the modern-day world. This civilization collapses as part of Deus' plan, but then Episode 4 takes place a couple thousand years after that, and 500 years before Xenogears, and focuses on an important war, as well as the incarnation of Abel known as Luxin. This is also the origin and the backstory for two important antagonists in Xenogears proper, being Graf and also Krelian. So yes, a war taking place 500 years prior to the main game that also focuses on the origins of a couple villains, including one who wears a mask. Yes, Torna the Golden Country is very, very much the Episode 4 to Xenoblade 2's Episode 5. And then we come to Episode 5. Xenogears, the story, the game we got. Deus is set to resurrect 10,000 years after the crash of the Eldritch, and this story focuses on the final incarnation of Abel, named Fei Fong Wang, and his efforts to stop this from happening. This story has a lot of twists and turns, but it ends with Deus being destroyed, and of course, the Zohar departing. Gears Episode 6 is unknown, but it is teased that it happens directly after or close after 5, and is a very, very pivotal thing for the history of either the world or the universe. Before we talk about Saga, I want to make a couple other quick comparisons. Ion, Zanza, and Deus are all demiurges, defeated in Episode 5 of their timeline and created in Episode 1. Also, Ion is just straight up a reference to Deus, being a similar type of weapon, having a very similar design, and one key difference. Ion's AI was handled in a much different way than Deus's was. Deus's was able to change in a way that gave it, I guess, what you consider ambition and allow it to take over the ship, while Ion's was designed more intelligently, using the Trinity processor, which had 3 different minds and a system of checks and balances. So, it's kind of interesting how, yes, Ion is the final boss still, but it's it being controlled as a puppet, being manipulated by one of the 3 AIs, which has all gone out of whack, as opposed to its own internal computers itself, calling for destruction. And now it's Xenosaga time. This series borrows extremely heavily from the concepts for Perfect Works Episode 1, including such things as the Zohar being discovered at the same time and place, the story picking up a few millennia after humanity went for the stars, Earth being lost, although it is justified in the Xenosaga universe, a galactic federation, Earth being called Lost Jerusalem, a capital also with Jerusalem in the name, and even the adoption of a new calendar system known as Transcend Christ at some point after the Earth was left behind. The 3 main Xenosaga games and canon spin-offs all come together to tell a very Episode 1-like story, involving an interplanetary war that heavily focuses on the Zohar, and even including a few things that could be sort of counterparts to Deus. Now, the Xenosaga series was also originally intended to be 6 parts, and it's somewhat unknown exactly what would have been in the later ones, especially because things from the original Xenosaga Part 1 ended up split between Parts 1 and 2 of the final series. What we do know, though, is that a scene at the end of Xenosaga 3 shows a broken and battered kos-mos drifting towards Lost Jerusalem, which was the character's goal to locate it at the end of the final game, so it's possible that if the series had continued, there would have been some potential Episode 2-like shenanigans going on, with Lost Jerusalem being found and recolonized by humanity. Finally, we'll dip quickly into the Cross timeline because it's actually the least fleshed out, and also the one with some of the weirdest things going on. First off, this is the only timeline to lack an explicit Zohar. However, Elma might be the equivalent, because she shows up in the middle of the 21st century and provides things that greatly enhance humanity's technology level. It's not explained exactly what she brought, but since she shows up at the same time, and the Lifehold she helped create has a bunch of Zohar references in it, either she's just a living equivalent of the Zohar, or the unknown tech she brought to humanity was in fact the Zohar itself, or a Zohar emulator a la Xenosaga. X also takes place right after Earth is lost, and involves fighting aliens and making home on a new planet, so it might be a weird hybrid combo of episodes 1 and 2, which take place back to back, or a prequel to this universe's episode 1, and the actual war would only begin after humanity finds a way to leave Mira and fight back in earnest against Samar, but it's entirely unsure as of now. We would need a Xenoblade X sequel to tell exactly what episode this could be classified as. And so in conclusion, I'd like to quickly touch on a couple theories that would connect all of the games together. It's important to mention that these are all by definition non-canon, except for the fact that Xenoblades 1 and 2 are connected because of the IPs being owned by different publishers. These are just fun fan theories trying to piece everything together, and don't have any basis in the actual games. One possibility is the universe getting reset. The main villain of the Xenosaga series has the goal of restarting the universe in order to prevent it from getting destroyed. He is stopped by the end of the series, but it's confirmed that he succeeded in resetting the universe many times before, so it's possible that all of the other timelines I talked about were just previous incarnations of the universe, and Saga is the final loop, and the universe was just brought back different every time. This could possibly explain the parallels, because a theme in the resetting is that the human condition is suffering war and bloodshed, and even throughout being reset, humanity doesn't seem to really learn from its mistakes, which would explain a lot of the similar events and all the parallels between the different universes. Another theory is that there is just a shared multiverse, where it's either the same Zohar popping up in multiple places throughout space-time, or multiple Zohars that lead to the same upper dimension. This theory is my personal favorite because it would allow for a crossover of all the Xeno series that could potentially tie up loose ends for the stories that didn't get that treatment. Also, if a spin-off involving more universes than just Xenoblades 1 and 2 happened, this would probably be the explanation for how everything happened, either that or some extreme hand-waving. This is also arguably the justification already used for kos-mos' appearance in crossovers as a representative of Bandai Namco. Xenoblade 2 is an exception to this, because it seems that that version of her is in fact a different being to the Xenosaga one, so only Xenosaga kos-mos appearing in crossovers would be justified by the Zohar sending her places and stuff. But yeah, that is all I got. Thank you so much for watching this video. As always, I know it's kind of a weird one in multiple ways. I'm sorry for all the wacky editing stuff, but I'm a little bit burned out after all this. I'm happy that Xenoblade Definitive Edition exists, but it might take a little bit of a toll on my content creation for the meaningful future. But hey, don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. And I am even more hyped than all of you are combined. Trust me, I just can't demonstrate it very well right now. But yeah, this was a weird couple of weeks of digressing into some meta perfect work stuff, but I think I'm going to go back into the normal style of videos starting next week. Actually, next week's a D&D week, never mind. But other than that, it's going to be the normal stuff with some speculation and wants for Definitive Edition sprinkled in there, alongside the Xenogears recaps, and I hope you stick around for all of it. So until next time, this is Luxin, signing off.